Welcome, everybody. My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, and we will start in a few seconds here, letting some people come in from the waiting room. Okay, if you can hear us, maybe you can put in the Q&A box, yes, that you can hear me, just to make sure the volume and the audio is working well. Okay, okay. As long as I have more than one person, we're good to go. Okay. So my name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, as I mentioned. I am the program director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program at Columbia University in the city of New York. And we run these monthly webinars during the course of the academic year. And today we have a wonderful session on the data myth, interrogating the evidence base of evidence-based peace building. And before I get to that in a minute, if you are interested in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program, which we nickname NECR, please stay on after the webinar because we will have somebody here to answer any questions you might have about the program, about admissions, and so on. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and that is Pamina Furchow and Roger McGinty, and both of them are co-founders of Everyday Peace Indicators, which was founded in 2011. Pamina is a professor at Brandeis Heller School of Policy and Management, and Roger is professor at Durham University School of Government and International Affairs. The webinar is probably going to be about a 30-minute presentation, and what we encourage you to do is please put any comments or questions you have in the Q&A box, because at the end of the webinar, we're going to have an opportunity for the speakers to answer your questions. So I think without further ado, we can switch slide sharing, and we'll just turn it over to Pamina and Roger. Thank you very much, and please take it away.
Thank you. Very good to be here. Thanks to SBS for the invitation. I'm going to present first, and then Pamina will follow. So we want to talk about the data myth, which is the title of a forthcoming book. And it really concerns itself with a series of practical and ethical dilemmas linked to data in relation to peace and conflict. And when you think about it, we've probably never had as much data in relation to peace and conflict at the moment. But it's also worth thinking that levels of conflict and issues related to conflict, like displacement, are increasing as well. In other words, data isn't the answer to everything. So the data myth, we see it as the fetishization of objective data, or so-called objective data, more data, and faster data. And the belief that if we have objective data, more data, faster data, this will lead to better conflict response outcomes. Let's be clear, Pamina and myself are not arguing against data. We are pro-data, but we're pro-responsible data. We're pro-data collection and data storing and data management protocols that are mindful of the ethics of the data cycle. There is a belief that I've alluded to at the very beginning that somehow we can data our way out of conflict. Everywhere I look, there is a new data set. There are new data initiatives. But I think we need to be prudent. We need to be careful. We need to think through the implications of our relationship with data. And all of this, of course, is linked to power and the ability of some actors to extract data, to organize data, to disseminate data, and fundamentally to create hierarchies of data in which some forms of data have more apparent legitimacy and authority than other forms. And we've written a little about this in a journal article already published in the journal Data and Policy, and it's open access. So where did all this begin for Pamina and myself? Well, as already mentioned in the introduction, we founded Everyday Peace Indicators about 15 years ago. There are, of course, many indicator systems out there, but everyday peace indicators, community sources indicators of peace, reconciliation, development, security, etc. In other words, we ask people, if you were to look for peace or reconciliation or change in your everyday life, how would you notice that? What would the indicators be in your neighborhood? How would you notice it on the walk to work or the walk to school or the grocery store? And the aim was to counter the dominance of top-down metrics in which indicators are decided in Western capitals and then taken to the global south to be part of survey experiments. And we wanted to experiment with participatory approaches to data, participatory numbers. And we've worked at the local level with local partners in 11 countries. Peter from SBS has been heavily involved in everyday peace indicators. Now, our work with everyday peace indicators has brought us into connection with the conflict response sector. We've become very aware of the role that data plays in this sector. We've become aware of the political economies of this sector. We've had very many conversations or working relationships with people in the humanitarian or development or peace building world. And this really got us thinking about their attitudes towards and use of data, the extent to which their relationship with data was participatory, was inclusive or exclusive. And also, we met during the course of our work with everyday peace indicators with many from the monitoring and evaluation world, who, in a sense, were having a crisis of confidence that monitoring and evaluation was quite shallow, was extractive, and not participative. So our interest is in this conflict response sector, which we see as being quite broad and dynamic. It's clearly under pressure, has been under pressure over the past few years. It has both elements of being siloed, but also elements of interlinkage. And in this sector, data is a currency. In many ways, the sector is data, or it's co-constituted by data. Data has a value. It allows organizations, whether UN agencies or INGOs or NGOs, it allows them to speak on a particular topic or act on a particular topic with authority. It allows them or affords them a seat at the table. If they don't collect data, they may not have competency over a particular thematic area. And of course, just to keep going in terms of servicing the requirements of auditors and donors, they need to collect large amounts of data and feed that data back in particular ways. Now, we see data, next slide, please, Pamina. We see data as being both qualitative and quantitative. It's systematically organized. There's an intentionality there in terms of research design. Often collection occurs at scale. And data inhabits and co-constructs methods, regimes, or particular epistemologies that order data, that are full of assumptions in a way. The data sphere includes both top-down and bottom-up data, and there are questions to be asked on the extent to which those spheres are complementary to one another. Of course, the collection, storage, interrogation, dissemination of data is very much fueled by technology. There is, in a sense, a technological arms race going on in relation to data and technology. And of course, all of that is linked with issues of power. And of course, there are issues of governance. One of the key conflicts that we've already seen in the 21st century, but we will continue to see in this century, is a three-cornered fight between individuals, corporations, and governments about who owns data, who has the right to data, who governs data. And conflict-related data and peace-related data, it cannot escape that contest or conflict. Okay, so let me look at the first element of the data myth, and that is objective data. Remember, it's this three-part myth that involves objective data, faster data, and more data. And I think it's worth questioning the notion of data objectivity in conflict-affected contexts. Can we, yeah, hurrah. It's worth questioning data objectivity in relation to conflict. But of course, there is a strong positivist tradition in relation to data, that data somehow can be neutral, somehow can be above the fray of politics and conflict, that there are facts, that we can objectively gather facts and get our way rationally out of human-made problems. It's worth unpicking that because, of course, data is political. These contexts are political. Data is a resource, and like all resources in conflict-affected contexts, data is going to be contested. Often humanitarian organizations in particular claim an exceptionalism, that somehow humanitarianism is accepted from this political world. That's, I think, a reasonably difficult argument to sustain. But of course, some actors have more power than others to make their data appear neutral, objective. And of course, all of this is linked to power. So if we move on to more data, then the case for more data is quite strong. Better informed policy making will lead, hopefully, to better policy and better conflict response outcomes. But there's a constant demand for more data. It's worth asking, how much data do we really need? We're in an era of, quite frankly, massive amounts of data, massive amounts of conflict-related data. We're in an era in which data is quantified by hundreds of zettabytes. A zettabyte is a billion bytes, unfathomable amounts of data. And we've seen this massive growth in the volume of data and data gathering in our sector. But it's worth asking, is all of this data being used? Is it being used to the best ability? Because there is a danger of information overload. This danger was signaled actually in the late 1960s. Often organizations lack the capacity to interrogate properly, analyze data. And we have to say that often there can be an ideological approach to data, in the sense that no matter how much data we collect, how well we put an argument, how bright and shiny visualizations are, those in power will ignore it. It's worth asking, in a sense, are we in a post-fact, post-evidence era in some respects? And therefore, no matter how much data we gather, it may not have the effects that we want. And calls for more data often are linked to a certain performativity. Those of us that work in universities will well be aware of the performativity involved in reporting upwards on how wonderful we're doing, how many students we've recruited, etc. Often this is performative. Often there's intra-organizational competition, for example, within the UN or large INGOs in relation to data collection. And often technology means we can harvest data without really thinking about key questions about why. And often we can collect the data, but actually policymakers or politicians are not ready to make those decisions. And then the third part of the data myth is faster data. And again, the belief here is faster data will lead to better conflict response outcomes. And one can certainly see arguments for that, particularly in relation to sudden onset humanitarian disasters. But again, there's a danger of data overload. It's worth remembering the timescapes or a construction that some crises are made and some actors have the power to designate a particular social process as a crisis, and they also have the power to ignore other issues and say that's not important. It's worth also noting that if we think about the history of technology, it is a history of acceleration, further and further, faster and faster. Yet there is a time lag in relation to the ability to analyze data and also a time lag in relation to policy making, decision making, funding cycles. And it's worth remembering, finally, how technocratic and bureaucratic imperatives play a huge role in all of this. So I'm going to hand over now to Pamina, who will continue the story of the data myth.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, so the book is mostly dedicated to setting up what the peacebuilding and conflict response fields are doing wrong around the use of data. And Roger has talked about more, faster, and objective data issues. So in the conclusion, we look at who governs the use and collection of data when it comes to conflict response. And there are several data protocols in the conflict response sector, and they show that there is serious thinking in relation to the management of data, and also guidance, right? Although as with most everything in multilateral governance, they have the status of guidance rather than enforceable rules. So here are some of the examples that we provide in the book. I'll just say the first three, the Interagency Standing Committee, the OECD DAC criteria, and the UN Humanitarian Affairs, are guidance documents and guidance actors who provide guidance for data responsibility and for evaluating activities. They provide guidance on how to do these, to use data ethically, and how data can be used responsibly within the sector. The Humanitarian Standards Partnership and Principles for Peace are standard-setting initiatives, and they support quality and accountability. Humanitarian Standards Partnership within the humanitarian sector, Principles for Peace within the peacebuilding sector, in order to ensure that standards, which are statements which describe the minimum conditions for life with dignity, are consistent throughout the sector. Other besides these initiatives, there are also individual organizations which have developed their own data management protocols and practices, and also trainings. And many organizations have invested heavily in data gathering and analysis capabilities, and have created websites, like, for example, Connexus, to try to share data and come up with interesting initiatives in order to reflect on data ethics. But there is no overarching mechanism that governs conflict response data among all the different sectors that are involved in what we are terming conflict response. So our research for this book also confirms observations made by other scholars like Robert Chambers, and I'm going to quote him because he concluded in 2017 that I have been struck by the scale and depth of what I have found, that error, myth, biases, and blind spots are deeply endemic, that widely accepted and required procedures, approaches, and concepts of rigor distort vision and diminish effectiveness, that the power of funding often carries conditions that misfit complex realities and incur high hidden costs. And this last chapter and sort of the conclusion, we've been focused for the majority of the book on the issues with the data use in the conflict response sector. What we're trying to do also in this book is to think about how we can do better. So we propose 5 tenets of good data practice when responding to conflict. And we start with disrupting the automatic pilot of data collection. And in this, we urge the sector to more intentionally think about how data informs programming and policy, and to reflect seriously about whether or not data collection is actually necessary. When dealing with data, we should ask a series of questions, and we propose some in the book. You can see them here. They're quite small. I'll give you 3 examples around relevance, purpose, and accuracy of the questions that we believe are important to ask before we think about data collection. Is the data directly related to the project? Does it address a specific question or contribute to a clear goal? Does the data collection contribute to fostering peace and positive outcomes? Around purpose, what is the purpose of collecting this data? Who are you informing with this data? How will it be used to inform decisions, solve problems, or advance understanding? And when it comes to accuracy, can the data be collected accurately and reliably? Are there potential sources of error or bias that could affect its quality? Have you considered the positionality of the researcher or the evaluator on the resulting data and findings? So these questions frame the section and are related to the other tenets, and should be, and we stress are fundamental to responsibly using and gathering data in the field. But we also should ask ourselves whether data collection is always even the most effective way to communicate value and effectiveness. Oftentimes in conflict response work, we're collecting data to demonstrate effectiveness vis-a-vis donors or constituents, and not necessarily for learning. But scholars, like for example, Jens Egger or Sebastian Schneider, in studies have demonstrated that comparing the amount of aid of a given country to that of other countries, or appealing to emotional and anecdotal stories, anecdotes can be really important, and simple ways of transmitting effectiveness, like for example, stories or photography, can really be much more effective when it comes to demonstrating impact or the importance of aid than scientific evidence. We need to be vigilant of the purpose of the use of the data, and if we're trying to demonstrate impact and utility, this can be done in many different ways and doesn't necessarily require scientific approaches. And so we can do, I mean, I guess the message here is that we can transmit and communicate impact without necessarily having to collect data that creates indexes or rigid monitoring and evaluation systems, or necessarily produce scientific evidence. Second, we advocate for using data for people power. And so, as I said, we usually think of data use in conflict response as something that speaks to donors or to constituents, to people outside of the conflict response space. And we do also use data and recognize its utility for program design and the improvement of programs that implementers are administering for donors, right, or for governments. But we rarely think about the use of data as a potential for people power or for activism of the communities themselves where we are sourcing the data. In this case, data collection is not merely something imposed on communities and instead becomes participatory and a useful exercise for them. Providing data to people in ways that can be useful to them requires creativity and really a reorientation of the way we disseminate the knowledge based on data collection in the field, which usually is in the form of a report or maybe a presentation. But there are other ways of disseminating data, and we have done that with everyday peace indicators, and some examples of our efforts to productively seek to give data back to communities have been, here you can see in the pictures, photo voice projects and card games, where we've used our indicators to inform participatory photography projects with the communities to help guide and frame photography around peace and peace-related concepts like justice and coexistence, in order to give people the opportunity to reflect on the data that we have collected, but also to give people the opportunity to create more data by visualizing the indicators and using those visualizations as a platform for dialogue and reflection within the communities. And so you can see how then data is transformed into a peace building project in and of itself. We've also done this through card games where we create, we've done this in Colombia, recetas para la paz, or recetas para la convivencia, which is like recipes for peace or recipes for coexistence, and where people use our indicators that have been developed by their neighbors or by other individuals within their communities to come up and, well, to reflect further and come up with these recipes for peace that they can act on. And we've seen real change come from this use of data as people power, right? Where we've brought the data back to them and given them the opportunity to reflect in creative ways. And then they have turned around and used this to do productive projects or for advocacy. I mean, this is just an example here. This is an artesian well in San Jacinto, Colombia, where they use the card games to then develop this project, this productive project. But we've seen communities clean cemeteries, advocate for trash removal, using the data, the process of us returning our data to them in creative ways. So the third tenet is around recognizing how power and identity shape data and evidence, and taking positionality seriously. Data in the conflict response sector, and I'm talking about in particular in practice when we're talking about evaluations or when we're talking about indexes or large-scale policy efforts, rarely recognizes positionality. So it's really important to consider the responsibility of any agent that is involved in knowledge production. And we need to reflect more about the terminology we use and the way we present our findings. Oftentimes, there's a lack of humility in the presentation of policy findings within conflict response. And the study of everyday life in extreme conditions requires the search for new flexible methodologies that help us to rethink researchers' positionality toward conflict, and find possibilities to involve diverse actors who may voice various identities, and acknowledge knowledge and power positions in the process of knowledge production and dissemination. And these things are really important and rarely done. Also, interestingly, it's rare to find an acknowledgement of funding within data collection and analysis processes. And this is also very important when we're thinking about how power and identity shape data and evidence. And the interdisciplinarity, intersectionality, and awareness of limitations improves the quality of knowledge verification procedures, and minimizes the influence of inequalities and hierarchies and their associated risks of distortion or misinterpretation of data, especially as we're trying to quickly collect data, quickly analyze data, and quickly transform it into recommendations. Fourth, do no harm. We already talk a lot about do no harm when it comes to peace building and humanitarian work, but we also need to think about do no harm and conflict sensitivity when it comes to data collection and interpretation. There should be a detailed description of all limitations included, not only in academic publications, but again, in evidence production and in evaluation reports. Data collectors must take proactive measures to mitigate risks and prioritize the rights and the protection of the participants and ensure their dignity. There should be an acknowledgement that the time from knowledge production to implementation is rapidly shortened in crisis situations, in conflict situations, which require a quick response. So that, again, this is again an acknowledgement of the limitations because it increases the risk of errors. It can lead to significant increase in researchers' professional and social responsibilities. Finally, we also advocate for maximization of data use. Oftentimes, we have this tendency to use the data for reports, to report to donors, to inform a policy report. So we collect the data, we publish the report, we file away the data. But we believe that we can maximize data use. We don't need to use it only for one purpose, right? And this is in part of the goals in data sharing that a lot of these also data governance efforts have tried to advocate for, Connexus, for example, but also within organizations and within projects, we can really try to maximize the data use rather than just using it once for a report. So we've done this at Everyday Peace Indicators by trying to utilize our indicators for various different actors. So I've already talked about how we use our indicators to inform people power, so communities. But we also oftentimes, so we'll be contracted, for example, to use indicators to collect indicators for evaluations or to guide programming. So here you can see, for example, an indicator that an individual indicator that might be helpful for a civil society organization, right? There is a funeral committee in Indrasarapura. This is an indicator from Sri Lanka. And Indrasarapura is a village in Sri Lanka where we were guiding CSO programming. So here you can see a CSO could help organize, offer funding, or provide a space to meet with villagers volunteering their time to participate and lead the funeral committee. But we have always found that we've also found that indicators can provide guidance to other actors, like, for example, policymakers, both at the local as well as the national level. And so we very much advocate internally for a maximization of our data use, to use those indicators not just to guide the programming within a village, but also to think about how they might influence policy issues locally or nationally. So here, I'll just use one of these examples here. The first one under local policy issues. Due to the cancellation of land documents issued before 2008 by Punagari Divisional Secretariat, land documents should be issued to all of the existing residents of Palabara Bankatu. So this indicator, unlike the previous one, cannot be addressed by a civil society organization, since it, except for maybe advocacy reasons, since it demands a political commitment, right? And administrative decisions by regional or possibly even national government actors. So we can see we've used our data not only to inform the programming here, but also to inform thinking around what needs to be done at a policy level. And what's important to keep in mind here is that in many cases we can reuse data, but the product should look different for different actors, which means that time and effort needs to be dedicated for each individual data utilization. So data can be reused, but when we reuse it and we're speaking to different actors, time and effort needs to be dedicated to repackaging it. Finally, in conclusion, I've just left us here with some questions around the data use and conflict response. Should we advocate for more data governance when working with data in a conflict response situation? Should there be a mechanism that establishes universal conflict response standards? So we've seen these data governance mechanisms. Should we, for example, have a universal conflict response effort that establishes standards and that governs data collection and data use, and integrates potentially the tenets that we've recommended? Another question that we haven't really touched on much in this presentation, don't touch on much in our article, but do discuss somewhat in our book, is what is the potential of peace tech and AI and the role of data in using technology for peace and technology for conflict response, right? What is the relationship between peace tech and data? And what role does conflict response data play in the fake news era? A question I think that a lot of us are asking nowadays is, can we trust data anymore? Especially when leaders are talking about common sense standards rather than evidence-based standards. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was such a provocative presentation, and it just echoes a lot of the conversations we have about power, bias, objective, and all of that, what we put into our teaching. And I was thinking about the long-term implications of every time there's data that's collected objectively, right, without bias, but how it's used. So if it's used in policy making, as you mentioned, to inform policy, that's a long-lasting effect. And then we write articles with it, and then people cite us with it, and then it just lives on even afterwards. So it's so hard to go back to sort of rewind that there. We do have a couple of questions. The Q&A has been lively. So I guess I'll just start out by one is sort of a differentiation there. When you say data, somebody's questioning, do you mean information, which is data in context, and then data information in context, and then also the knowledge, which is data information in the context applied to experience and organizational role. So there's data, but they're talking about it as information and knowledge. Do you differentiate, or how do you differentiate that terminology?
if I may, and well
Please.
done, Brett. You've been busy in the chat, which is something we like to see. Well, there is, of course, the well-known taxonomy of data, information, knowledge, wisdom, with each of those elements gaining a little along the way. It's pretty unwieldy if you're going to write a book on the subject. So we plumped on using the term data um, for a number of reasons. First, all of these begin life as data. They may be augmented along the way. And also, organizations refer to this as data. So, for example, the UN might have data management protocols, but it doesn't have wisdom management protocols. So we used it partially because of convenience, but also in the book we do unpack this a little, and we are very aware that it is context, that it is power, that it is about these hierarchies into which data is shoehorned. But a good question. Thank you.
And then also,
Can I just add?
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe I wasn't paying attention in the presentation, but just to stress too, I mean, there are many different ways of defining data, and there's a whole literature on this. And actually, it was really interesting to be able to write the chapter on how we define data, because it gave me at least an opportunity to reflect on, like, what does this even mean, right? And what do we mean when we're talking about data use and conflict response? We chose, and again, many different ways of defining data. We chose to define data as systematically collected information. So we're defining it as Roger said, as the way that we see the field as defining it, right? As a process of gathering information in a systematic way using, in most cases, social science methods of some sort.
Great. And I guess question linking to that is framing, is it how much data or how much context do we need to really, I guess, understand the data and situate it? Would you like to comment on that?
I think very often the issue is that data is not contextualized. In fact, there are, in a sense, processes of data dump in which huge amounts of data reach those expected to analyze it. And of course, in order to contextualize that, you need a number of resources, not least time, but very often in-country contextual knowledge. And one of the issues is that data is taken out of country, is decontextualized, or has never been contextualized in the first place. And much of this, of course, is fueled by technology. And I guess the question becomes, does the politics of data become yet another source of imposition, both imposition and extraction?
Great. And I think Peter wants to pop in here and ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And thank you, Pamina and Roger. So I have a question around the motivations behind data collection. And you refer to this a bit in your presentation. You also refer to it in your article. To illustrate what I mean, I'm just going to start with a very brief anecdote, which was when I was a young grad student. I was in Eastern Congo doing a bit of work with the UN mission there. And I met a very nice political affairs officer. And I learned that every night he would go back to his room and he would write up like a 3 to 5 page report on the day's activities. And I asked him, well, what happens with that information? And he essentially looked at me and shrugged. Because what you were doing with that to him didn't really matter. It was the exercise, right? And so I bring up that anecdote to highlight the point that, as I think you mentioned, for many of these, especially large bureaucracies, the production of data is just a technocratic everyday exercise, right? It's just part of running a bureaucracy. So that's one kind of motivation. And you talk about the need to justify and prove the effectiveness of your program for fundraising, right? You talk about the importance of being able to sort of claim legitimate knowledge as power. And so there are various, motivations that go into the maintaining and propelling the data myth. And so my question is, after all that, in terms of your recommendations, does it make sense to sort of think about how those recommendations might apply more or less to the different kinds of motivations that propel actors to collect data in this conflict response world?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And potentially, I think, we really do need to think about, one of the recommendations, I think throughout the recommendations, it's very clear that we need to think about who or what we are producing the data for, right? That is the main goal of thinking through logical process of collecting data within conflict response is to think about what how we're best going to use that data, right? And so when we think about, this question of motivations and the motivation of data collection, in some cases, maybe we're speaking to donors, or we need concrete kind of statistics or concrete information that policymakers are going to use in a presentation to Congress, for example. In other cases, maybe we need the information to actually inform learning, right? And the productive exercise of thinking through how to improve a project. And those goals are going to be very different. So I think when we think about how, and when we think about the recommendations and we think about how to productively use data, we really need to think about that piece, that element. It should be something that we think about in each of the tenets, right? And should be a theme, a cross-cutting theme across the recommendations, because the motivations are so important to consider at the outset, at the very beginning, when we begin to collect the data. We need to think about why we're collecting that data, and that will then also in turn influence what decisions we make about how we collect data, and whether or not that data needs to be scientific or whether it can be more anecdotal.
Yeah, so the risk I'm hearing also is that if we are only collecting data to satisfy a need for a particular audience, we might be missing other pieces of data that could be informative in how we shape what we're communicating, right? So I think what I heard you saying, Pamina, was that we do need to have a broader collection of data, but then think about what is it we need to do with that data and how do we communicate it? Because I think to me there's different levels, right? So one is the actual data collection. What do we identify as data, which is partly influenced by the audience who we're delivering it to, and then how do we communicate that data? What do we do with it? So I think too often the risk is people narrow, they pigeonhole the kind of data they collect, just what they think would satisfy a particular need. Like if you have a funder, you're trying to satisfy the funding obligations so then you're only sort of communicating the part that satisfies that rather than the fuller picture. So a lot of risk involved and a lot of, I think, the wisdom involved in selecting the data.
Yeah, I think it's also an important question when it comes to like the maximizing data use recommendation, because we should maximize our data use as much as possible, right? And I think there is the potential, but we also need to recognize that in some cases you can't use data that's collected in a certain way for all actors, right? And you need to reflect on how you might go about, like I said, how you might go about collecting that data ahead of time. I mean, you need to think about the purpose, right? Because that will then influence how you collect the data or what data you use. So I think there's a dual question within maximizing data use in particular, where it's important to not file away data, but at the same time, we need to be vigilant that not all data can do everything.
Right, which kind of is a nice segue to the next question, because they're saying that there's a strong tendency of valuing quantitative data more than qualitative data for some audience, I guess. So the question really is about how do you navigate that to scholar, practitioner, policy advocates whose expertise leans more towards the qualitative styles? How do you reconcile that quantitative, qualitative conundrum?
Well, actually, when we started writing the book, we concentrated solely on quantitative data, and one can see, in a way, the benefits that quantitative data has. And it's based in this positivist tradition. Quantitative data can simplify extremely complex issues. It has an air of certainty and authority with it. But actually, when you think about it, most quantitative data begins as qualitative, it begins life as qualitative data. And when we think about the uses of data in the conflict response sector, very much it's about storytelling and constructing those stories, whether to a donor or to a population or to other uh, other sectors within a particular organization, then that story is often a mix of the qualitative and the quantitative. So I think it really is about this mixed political economy or mixed economy of data, in which both are crafted to tell stories. And it's rare that you will just see numbers without some sort of explanation. And often those explanations are complemented by numbers. So I think it's both. And there was a second question from Faria about our recommendations being grounded in feminist methodology. Actually, we do discuss in the book the gendering of data. Data reflects power structures, existing power structures, and those power structures often reflect patriarchy and exclusion.
Great. And the next question is really about, in a post-fact world, what's the proper way of collecting data in the way constituents are looking for certain kinds of things, which may or may not be technically appropriate. I think you did allude to the fact that sometimes you have to think about who the constituents are and how you collect the data, what qualifies as data, right? So any comments on that part, the first part of a question here?
Is this the one from Dan?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I
Or I
think
guess also changing people's minds. So how they're looking for
I
data.
think we're in a extraordinarily interesting but also scary point in of modernity, in which there is disinformation, misinformation, there is a swirl, and often there is little guidance about how to navigate our way through that. And I think actually this is a time for rigor. This is a time for social scientists to illustrate that they can handle complex research tasks in a particular way. And I think this really is a time to double down on the skill set that we bring as an academic community to the table. That would be my response. And I don't think we should do this in a defensive way. I think, we've got centuries of honing research technique behind all of us. And there's much pressure to dumb down, and there's much pressure to ignore evidence. But I think we don't want to get into the game of playing other people's games.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some of Dan's examples of this manifesting itself. But I mean, I think we need to be discerning. I agree that we need to do it respectfully, but providing examples of how to responsibly gather data or how to go about data collection, providing examples of how it's been done before, or how things have gone wrong before, for example, or potentially even, doing things like sending our article and saying, look, there are people out there in the field advocating for data collection in a responsible way. And so I think, information is power. And so informing actors, but I do agree. And I think we say this also in our book, is that that the onus is also on professors and universities, because we are the ones who are teaching future policymakers and project managers, et cetera, on methods and methodology and knowledge creation. And if what we're saying is quantitative rules, or you must be scientifically rigorous, and not explore that and unpack that and think about the value of different ways of approaching knowledge creation, then we can't be surprised later on when they are approaching knowledge creation in a certain way, in a very positivist way, potentially. And that then, can influence the work that they're doing and the broader sector. So I think there are multiple, I guess, actors responsible for informing the conflict response sector on how to responsibly use data and how to responsibly think about all of the stages in the data collection and analysis process.
Great. So thank you for your work, because I think that there is a misalignment between some things about what's being looked for, what funders are looking for, what people are being trained to do, and so on. But we are going to have to bring this to a conclusion. So I would encourage people to reach out to Pamina and Roger, maybe on LinkedIn. Maybe we can stick your emails in the chat here or something, but it's wonderful. I encourage everybody to read your book and your articles, and probably have a link in the chat for that too. And once again, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Sorry we didn't get a chance to address all the questions. And if you're interested in learning more about the programs, please stay on, because David Taylor Tumilty is here to answer your questions. Once again, thank you everybody for joining us. Bye now.